Guys, Boxing Gossip here, and I'm doing a video on the new IBF Top 15 heavyweight list that has recently been published. I've had a number of people send me messages and ask my opinion on the list, so I wanted to discuss that through in this video. The list is pretty relevant for UK boxing fans because, in all likelihood, once Anthony Joshua beats Dominic Breazeale, which we presumably all expect him to, we will be asked to pay $17.99 for a pay-per-view in the autumn of this year for Anthony Joshua versus one of the opponents from this list. Remember, for Joshua to defend his title on a voluntary basis, it's going to have to be against someone in the top 15 list. So, yeah, potentially a relevant list, and let's get started. Let's crack through it. So obviously, Joshua is the champion, as we know. Joseph Parker is the number one after he won a final eliminator versus Carlos Takam. No problems with that whatsoever. Kubrat Pulev is number two after he won an eliminator with Derek Chisora. No problems with that whatsoever either. Number three, and this is probably the most controversial inclusion in the list, is David Haye. Now, I guess it depends how you rate David Haye. If you rate David Haye on past form, his wins over Nikolai Valuev, Ruiz, etc., you could make an argument that he should be a ranked heavyweight. Based on more recent form, which presumably is what the IBF have decided to include him on, specifically I'm referring to Arnold the Cobra Jar Jar and also Mark the Mori, his inclusion in the top 15 list is bizarre. To include him at number 3 is super bizarre. And you kind of got to wonder what was going through the IBF's head when they made that decision. Did they not think there'd be a bit of a backlash to someone being rated number 3 in the world, having beaten Demori and Jar Jar? Because, let's be honest, how many of us would have even included one of those guys in our world top 50s, before the fights with David Haye? So, I can certainly see why that's controversial. Moving down the list, number 4, Johan de Par. Possibly slightly high for me, but he's coming off a very impressive win over Robert Helenius, so yeah, no major problems with that. Number 5 is Andy Ruiz, and for me, to have Ruiz at number 5 is as bizarre, if not more bizarre, as having David Haye at number 3. Ruiz is someone who has really failed to gather momentum in his career so far to date. The level of opponents he's been in with has been very poor, and unlike David Haye, who at least has some previous strong form, Ruiz has no form of any note at all to speak of. So his inclusion at this sort of level, to me, is another one I really can't get. For me, if we're looking at Ruiz, I certainly wouldn't have him in my top 30 based on form in the book, so to have him at number 5 is bizarre. Carlos Takam is at number 6. I was slightly surprised to see him so high after a loss to Joseph Parker, but based on the fact that he's behind Haye and Ruiz, I can't complain with that at number 6. Glasgow at 7. I guess they've decided to give him another chance based on the fact he lost his world title fight by injury. Molina at 8, again possibly higher than I'd like, but coming off a big KO win over Adamek. Breazeale at 9, Charles Martin at 10, Chisora at 11. Again, you could say charitable based on the fact he's coming off a big loss, but yeah, Chisora 11, David Price at 12, and I think people have been critical that Price has been included so highly. I think this is more to do with the fact that they are reinstating him following the Erkan situation, as opposed to putting him in because of what happened at Goodison Park 2 weeks ago when he fought the security guard. So I don't have a problem with them saying, right, we're going to put him back in a position that he was in before the Erkan situation. Number 13, Hughie Fury. You could say it's a bit early for Hughie to be going up the rankings, but let's face it, he's got some semi-decent wins against the likes of Rudenko and the likes of the guy he fought last time out, whose name I'm gonna temporarily forget. The guy who most people say beat Dominic Breazeale. Anyway, so I think Hughie deserves to be there or thereabouts, especially in the context of this list. I'd certainly have him well above Andy Ruiz, for example. Jarrell Miller at 14, and Bermain Stavern at 15. So it's an interesting list, basically. I'm just quickly box wrecking who it was who Hughie Fury met with, and yeah, Fred Cassie, that's it. So yeah, I mean, Hughie Fury, he's beaten Rudenko, who gave Lucas Brown hell. He's beaten Dominic Gwynn. He's beaten Fred Cassie, who gave Dominic Breazeale hell. Gave Chris Arreola hell. So I think that's fair enough, actually, which is good. But yeah, what's my overriding feeling of these rankings? Well, firstly, I just got to say, some of the names in there are bizarre to me. Haye at 3 is bizarre. Ruiz at 5 is bizarre. Jarrell Miller at 14, I think, is very, very charitable indeed. And a lot of people have been left out here. Now, I understand that the IBF are not going to rate other champions, so they're not going to have Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder. They're not going to have Luis Ortiz because he's got a version of the WBA belt. So we're going to take those guys out of the list. But for me, still, there are solid heavyweight competitors out there who I would pick to be in this list, well above the likes of Jarrell Miller and Andy Ruiz based on proven form. And I'm talking, Malik Scott. Malik Scott just beat Tony Thompson. I'm talking Gerald Washington, who just beat Eddie Chambers. I'm talking Alexander Ustinov, who's put together a string of wins. And the IBF have shown here they're not afraid of putting people in the list coming off a loss. I mean, if we look at their list here, you've got Chisora off a loss, Martin off a loss, Glazkov off a loss. So there's a lot of people there who are coming off a loss. And if we're not going to discriminate against those guys, where's Bryant Jennings? Bryant Jennings beat Spilka, beat Mike Perez. Where's Tony Thompson? Where's Robert Helenius? These are all names I'd have picked above Ruiz and Jarrell Miller, to be honest. So, as with all these lists, there's a few holes I'd like to pick in it in that sense. Obviously, the David Haye situation is particularly crazy. And there's also, the ordering of the list is also bizarre. You've got a guy like Bermain Stavern, who's got wins over the likes of Chris Arreola towards the bottom of the list, whereas you've got a guy like Andy Ruiz who's got no win of any note towards the top of the list. So, it makes confusing reading. What's interesting from an Anthony Joshua standpoint is the amount of domestic names that he has the potential to fight. Hughie Fury, David Price, Derek Chisora, David Haye, they're all on the list as top 15 heavyweights. They're all guys who Anthony Joshua can offer a domestic title fight pay-per-view against. And, to be honest, I expect him very much to go down that route, actually, between his voluntary with Dominic Breazeale and his mandatory with Joseph Parker. There's a spot for him to get at least one more fight in for Joshua. And don't be surprised if one of those names is the opponent picked. It wouldn't actually surprise me if the route that Team Joshua go down is David Price, actually. I'm just not 100% sure that Hughie Fury will take the fight at this stage with Anthony Joshua. Chisora, you'd have to say his marketability is at a low after the Pulev loss, and potentially he's going to be looking at fights with the likes of Dillian White instead. So it wouldn't surprise me if David Price is the route they chose. Price is going to put together 1 or 2 wins in quick succession, I suspect, and for me looked like all the issues that we know are in his game were still there last time out. So, perhaps they'll look to go in that direction. in terms of the other opponents, I guess the Par is a fight they could look at. That would certainly be a learning fight. You could class it as a very durable guy, the Par. Molina would be another one you could put in the sort of learning fight category. And, the fact that Steverns sneaks in at the bottom of the list is perhaps a further name you could throw into the mix in the category of the sort of learning educational section for a young prospect. So, yeah, I guess that's my thoughts in essence. Price, Hughie, Fury entering the list. I don't have too big a problem with that. David Haye and Andy Ruiz I've got a bigger problem with. There's a few names I'd have thrown in: Malik Scott, Gerald Washington, Ustinov, Bryant Jennings. It's unfortunate those guys didn't make the cut when some of the guys who did make the cut did. But you could go around trying to understand these things. But anyway, I'm thinking the domestic voluntary is the route this is going to go. The more I think about it, now that he's made the cut, I think David Price could be the route that we look at after Dominic Breazeale, and the route that Eddie Hearn will go down for Anthony Joshua in terms of trying to create and build another big pay-per-view. Let me know your thoughts. If you've enjoyed this, do hit the thumbs up. Cheers.